not sure why I'm sweeping wet leaves from these old stone steps. It's not like we get many trick-or-treaters here at Old Stonewall Farm. Well, in fact, we don't get any trick-or-treaters here at Old Stonewall Farm. This Halloween, I take to the woods, and I think about witch hunts from centuries ago. 1647 to 1663, 80 people throughout New England were accused of practicing witchcraft. 13 women and 2 men were executed. A few years later, in 1692, Salem, Massachusetts witch trials began. They only lasted a year, but 20 people were in fact executed. I once heard someone ask the question, why weren't we more afraid of the men who accused these people of witchcraft than the actual witches themselves? As I light the jack-o'-lanterns here at Old Stonewall Farm, I reflect on that question. Why aren't we more afraid of those who accuse others than the ones that are being accused? Witch hunts are still happening today.
Well, I was so excited because I had to show you my witch's broom that I got from the antique store the other day. It's not a witch's broom, but it is an old broom that would have been used to clean out the hearth. But here we are on Halloween, and I wanted to talk to you about how witch hunts are still happening this day. And I was thinking more and more about it because I recalled back when I was in 5th grade, a favorite book of mine, The Witch of Blackbird Pond. Now, Mrs. Wynne, my teacher, would read a few pages of that book every morning. Our classroom was located kind of in the lower part of the building. There was a window and you could see this fiery maple tree. And I remember one morning as Mrs. Wynne read that book that I was like staring at that fiery maple, and I was transported back to 1600s Connecticut, where the main character, Kit, is an orphan, and she comes from Barbados to live with her mother's family in Puritan, Connecticut. So right from the get-go, she is looked at as different because she has silk and bright colors, where the Puritans were more reserved in how they dressed and their mannerisms. What makes it really troublesome for Kit is that as they're pulling into the Connecticut Cove, the harbor there, a young girl loses her doll and no one goes to rescue it, and Kit jumps into the water because she can swim. She grew up in Barbados, but of course everyone thinks now that she's a witch because she didn't sink to the bottom, but she was able to float and to swim. And the story continues on basically about how no one understands anyone who is different. So there's this old lady in a boggy area who Kit befriends, and her name is Hannah, and everyone says that she is a witch because she lives there by herself, and they just, again, they don't understand anyone who is different. And that's a quote in the book as well. It's like they don't make the time to get to know Hannah, and so they are afraid of her. They are afraid of what they don't know. Witch of Blackbird Pond, it is one of my favorites, and the more I think about it, I think that book really formed me in my love for all things colonial and early American, because even at that young age, I could close my eyes and I could feel the breeze as Kit stands on the deck of the Dolphin, the ship that is bringing her to Connecticut. I could feel the breeze. I could just imagine the fire crackling as she tries to make Indian pudding and she fails because she's never cooked before and she can't stand the hot flames, so she just pours all of the cornmeal into the big pot that's boiling so it's lumpy and not smooth for her family to eat. But that book really formed me, and I didn't realize that it was a book that is one that young tweens, teenagers, preteens are often reading in school. It turns out it was written in the 1950s, and it is one of the award-winning preteen books. And the lesson is very powerful. It is a lesson on how we fear those who are different, how we don't take time to understand those who are different, who dress differently, who have different viewpoints. And when we are afraid of something that we don't understand, we tend to lash out. And so it is a good book for teenagers to read, because I think a lot of that is happening today. And imagine my surprise a few years ago when I was a pastor down in Maryland. We were on this youth retreat, and it was a Friday night, and we're all, about to get ready for bed. And sure enough, a fifth grader pulls out the book that she's reading for school, The Witch of Blackbird Pond. And I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, that's one of my favorite books. And she said, it's one of my favorites too, Pastor Donna. So it is exciting to know that teenagers are still reading this book. But it is Halloween, and I have my witch's broom. And whenever we think about witches, we always think about Salem, Massachusetts, and the great witch hunt then. But witch hunts have been happening all throughout history. And in Europe, there were often these breakouts of witch hunts where many women were condemned to die by various means, by either drowning or being beheaded or burned. And if you're an Outlander fan, it is this TV show based on the New York Times bestselling novels. The first season or two, there is a character called Gillis Duncan, who is accused of being a witch. And turns out that Gillis Duncan was indeed a real woman in 16th century Scotland who was accused of being a witch, and she was later condemned to die as one. But before she died, she gave the names of a whole bunch of other women as well. But when you do the research into all these situations where a woman was accused of being a witch and then sentenced to death, if you delve into what was really happening or the backstory, oftentimes you will discover that the backstory is basically someone didn't understand the person or didn't like the person. One woman that Gillis condemned as a witch. Well, it turns out the king wanted this woman dead anyway because she was a widow and she had a lot of property. So if she was put to death, that property would go to the king. So there was a motive for this woman to be condemned as a witch and put to death. When we think about witch hunts of yesteryear, it is sad to realize that these witch hunts still happen today when people are misunderstood. I just was thinking about that more and more, and about this time last year, I came to you and I was struggling and I was going through a lot with a previous job that I had. And I loved that job, and I think I'm still mourning it, to tell you the truth. I am mourning that position because it really was an outlet for my creativity. But what happened was a political situation, as always in corporate America, especially a religious organization. It was political agendas and a witch hunt. Basically, witch hunts happen in life, in corporate America, in churches, in any organization, in families. If someone needs a scapegoat or someone needs to point fingers at somebody that they feel threatened by, a witch hunt happens. And maybe that's extreme as to what I went through, but it just was a reminder that there is a mob mentality. It's a reminder that oftentimes when a person begins to go after another person for whatever reason it might be, that the bystanders, those that you think are your friends, those who you have worked with, they remain silent. No one seems to stand up. And that happened too with the witch hunts that we have seen all throughout the centuries. People tend to be silent. Now, the very last witch who was executed in Europe happened to be in Switzerland. And I could not believe when I read this, because my father is Swiss. So I was like, wow, I had no idea that Switzerland had that, I don't want to say honor, but Switzerland has that reputation for putting the very last witch to death. She was beheaded. Anna was her name. And basically, once again, people were accusing her, and she managed to escape, but they finally tracked her down, and she had a whole trial. And I believe it was 30 people said no, do not execute her, but 32 said yes. So it was a very slim margin in which she was put to death. And a lot of people were embarrassed that Anna was condemned to die in such a way. Now, a lot of the material that is written at the time, I think a lot of the material leaves out that she was accused of witchcraft, because it was the time of the Enlightenment. And so people were more educated. And for this woman to be condemned as a witch in a time of being enlightened and not having all these superstitions, floating around, was kind of a black mark on the Swiss people. So I think a lot of what is written, if you find about Anna, I think they keep the witch part hush hush. But she was accused of being a witch, of making a child sick. The backstory was basically she, I believe, had an affair with one of the husbands. There was something scandalous going on. And so to get rid of her, this is what the people accused her of. Once again, if you look at all these stories of women who were condemned as witches, there's often a backstory that either somebody wanted their land, or somebody wanted to get back at them for them having an affair with a husband or whatnot. There's always a reason. And as the Witch of Blackbird Pond reminds me, Hannah, the old lady who lived by herself in the bog, and Kit, they were accused because they just had a different viewpoint. They had a more open viewpoint of the world, of one another. They thought differently. They were more educated. They dressed differently. And the people in that community, the Puritans, just could not get on board with anyone being different. Turns out Anna, who was the last witch in Switzerland and all of Europe to be executed in the late 1700s. Well, in 2008, the Swiss government finally exonerated her. And in 2014, a museum was created to tell her story. I just wish that we lived in a world in which people didn't have to be exonerated. I wish we lived in a world where we didn't have to have museums or memorials to really remember the real story of a person. I wish we lived in a world where there weren't any witch hunts at all. I wish we lived in a world in which we no longer were afraid of that in which we just don't understand. I wish we lived in a world where we didn't fear someone who is different, someone who thinks differently. I just wish we didn't live in a world where we sought out to destroy another. Witch hunts still happen today, be it in corporate America, the church setting, a family setting, whatever, wherever it might be. There's always someone who's going to be afraid of something that they don't understand. Oftentimes, I too am afraid of things I don't understand. But I don't want fear to take over me. I don't want fear in me to build a protective wall around me that I don't allow anyone to really enter into my life and to open my eyes to enlighten me. And so this Halloween, know that there are still witch hunts. And if you find yourself part of the mob, if you find yourself on the sidelines being silent when somebody else is being persecuted, Find the courage to speak up. And if you find yourself afraid of something that you don't know, take time to ask questions. Take time to research. Take time to learn, to discover. Because if we did that, the world would be a better place. We can decide if we want to be those people in the world that speak up and enlighten those who are walking in darkness.